So with Games Workshop releasing FAQ after FAQ to try to repair some of the issues and ambiguous rules that they have left in their 9th edition rule set, I thought it would be a good opportunity to go through the rule set and talk about some of the rules that I noticed that are a little ambiguous and may be subject to an FAQ in the not too distant future. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, as always, and today we're going to talk about some rules in 40k that still need answering, potentially in an FAQ, or maybe just a designer's commentary. Honestly, just a tweet from the designers. That would be great. Just a couple little things that I think we need to get cleared up, both in the GT 2020 packet and in the core rulebook itself. Well, the FAQs have done a good job of clearing up a lot of the questions that we've had on a lot of the individual rules in these books. There are a couple that I think have slipped through the cracks and that people maybe haven't yet analyzed really closely, and where there is still a little bit of ambiguity that could get cleared up. Now, I did talk about a lot of the recent FAQs in one of my recent videos where I may or may not have misread a rule. Very embarrassingly. Whoopsie daisies. But I would highly recommend you go check out that video and take a look at some of the FAQ rules that have come out, because I do think they do answer a lot of questions and they do clear up a lot of the sort of strange mechanics that were introduced in 9th edition that didn't really work, I think, quite as well as the designers originally intended. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the rules. I have the GT 2020 packet here, and I have the 40k core rules here, and I do have just a couple bits I want to point out that I think could use a little bit of additional clarification. The first one is under the movement of units. There is a statement in this rule that says when you move a model, no part of the model's base or hull can be moved across the bases or hulls of other models. And for the most part, I think the clear intent there is that you can't sort of climb over people, right? The hull of a model, if it's being used to measure distances, is basically any part of the model. And so you can't, move your infantry model so that it physically clambers up the side of a tank or something like that. That would be an illegal game state. The issue is the use of this word across. It seems to me, like I mentioned, that the intention is that the bases or hulls of the models don't interact at all. But if we just Google a definition for the word across here, the first one that comes up is movement over a place or a region, meaning that no physical contact is implied. So the question there, and especially for units like vehicles that measure from their hull, you can imagine things like grav tanks or sort of strangely composed vehicles like defilers, which have a hull on the table that's an enormous footprint. A defiler can have 4 legs that touch the table, but also have these enormous claws that reach out, and all of those are considered part of its hull. So the question is whether the intention of the rule is to prevent models from moving underneath the areas of that model's hull that aren't interacting with the table. If that is the intention, that does become problematic because, for example, if you have models in the first level of a piece of ruined terrain or a building or something like that, you could not then legally move models into the second level of that terrain, because in order to do so, they would have to move across the base of the model that's on the first level. I think for the most part, it makes sense and it plays the most cleanly if we assume that this across just means that the base or hull of a model cannot contact the base or hull of another model. But you then get into these weird situations where you can then move your models underneath things like grav tanks or defilers and have them legally positioned totally beneath these big units. I don't think that's as big of an issue, to be honest, and I think it probably plays fine, but I do think that it is worth a bit of a clarification from the rules design team and a double check into the way units move in the game currently. Now we're back to the GT 2020 packet here with some terrain rules, and one rule that is very commonly played currently is the interaction between the obscuring keyword and obstacle terrain that has that keyword. So obviously the obscuring keyword causes a terrain feature to block line of sight if you are not, quote, on or within the terrain feature. Now, if you have, for example, a linear wall that is effectively, let's call it like a two-dimensional plane. If you have, for example, like a linear wall or an obstacle that has the unstable position keyword, it becomes a little ambiguous what happens. The way that the measurement of games like Warhammer 40k work is that all measurements are inclusive. For example, if you have an ability that affects units within 6 inches of a model, and you place those models 6 inches, those two models are considered to be within 6 inches of each other, which means that extrapolating that, if you were to be touching a piece of terrain, you would be within the area of that terrain. Now, this is not prevented by the unstable position keyword. Unstable position only says that you can't end your movement on top of a terrain feature, which I think in basically by any stretch of the imagination would mean that your base is physically overlapping that terrain feature. So I don't think that there is a negative interaction between the obscuring terrain keyword and the unstable position keyword, but the question becomes, if you have something that you can't physically move on top of, but you touch it with your base, are you considered to be within the area of that terrain? If it is area terrain, do you get the effects of area terrain? Do you get any cover or dense cover or effects like that? And do you ignore that obscuring keyword? I think almost the entirety of the community plays it like you do currently, and I think, honestly, it just sort of makes thematic sense. If you have a big building with windows in it, and your models move up to the windows to see through them, then clearly they would be able to shoot and be shot through those windows. Whereas if they are a couple inches behind those windows, it makes sense that they would be taking cover, and they would be harder to hit and would not be eligible to be targeted. And I do think it plays the most cleanly that way, but again, it would be a nice thing to get clarified from the design team of the game. From here, we're gonna move into the actual grand tournament, the GT 2020 game sequence. Now, there is kind of a fundamental flaw in how this game sequence is set up, and I think that the Eternal War format also has a similar sequence, and it has kind of the same issue, which is that it is set up in such a way that it makes sense if you're going to play a pickup game to use this sequence and to follow it letter by letter. The downside is that this is a packet for tournament games, which typically that's not how they work. You're not just showing up at your game store and then you and your opponent choose how big your game's going to be, and then you build your army and you go through all those steps. A tournament is structured much differently, but for some reason, the grand tournament packet hasn't been laid out in a way to be compatible with an actual tournament format. The big question mark here is when this muster armies stage actually happens. I think for the most part, the intention for organized play is for these two stages basically to occur before the tournament starts, and then you get to the determine mission step here, and you just do that over and over every round that you play, and you can just keep going down the line with those. The issue is that that's not sort of spelled out, and it is a little frustrating that there isn't really a tournament format inside the tournament packet that goes further into explaining this. But it is a realistic question whether or not the intention of the rule is for you to design your list for every game that you play in a series of organized games. The reason that would be relevant is for things like pre-game selections that could be mutable. But if that's also the intention, then you could run into a situation where players are forced to bring their entire collection to play in a tournament and build a new list, a new 2,000 point list every game that they come to. I don't think that that's that is the intention, and I do think that Games Workshop's intention will become clear once they start running their own events, and I'm sure that they'll have a packet that meshes pretty well into the GT 2020 packet, but it is a little bit confusing right now because these pregame stratagems, which are stratagems that typically are used to allow factions a little bit of flexibility, are locked. However, sort of when that actually takes place in the structure of organized play is not really answered. Now, this question continues to the other steps of the format. For example, is it the intention for a tournament game for you and your opponent to roll a die every single time you play? Are tournaments even meant to have a set series of objectives, or that all of the players play, or is it the intention that players roll for them before the game? It's very confusing, and I think the only reason that this is confusing at all is because this is called a grand tournament packet, and if this was just, let's call it the open warfare format, or the super competitive game format, that wouldn't be quite as much of an issue. But it seems to be intended to play in tournaments, but the sequence of these events isn't really compatible with tournament play. It's very confusing. Now, moving on, all of the other questions that I have about 9th edition 40k so far revolve around secondary objectives and specifically actions. Now, there is a little bit of weirdness with actions, and honestly, it only comes from the difference between standard actions and psychic actions. And honestly, a lot of the confusion on my end comes from basically this one sentence here, which is that a unit can only attempt to perform one action per battle round, and the same action cannot be started by more than one unit from your army in the same battle round. Now, the only reason that that's confusing is that these two rules are entirely separate. And the performing psychic actions section doesn't have this clause. So it's ambiguous as to whether or not a psychic action can be attempted more than once per round. Normally, you could only cast a single psychic power from a psyker once each round, so you can't duplicate psychic powers. However, the psychic actions are not psychic powers. They require a psychic test, but they are not themselves a psychic power. Outside of using the same psychic test and deny mechanics that a psychic test does, it doesn't have any of the same restrictions that performing a psychic test normally would, besides the restrictions that are imposed specifically under the performing psychic actions rules. Now, this gets even weirder when we look at the individual secondaries that include actions in them, because most of them specify that one unit in your army can perform them each round, which makes a lot of sense because these actions, as we just read in the base rules, are designed such that only one of your units can perform each of them every round. The exception to that is Raise the Banners High, which, despite having that clause in the actions section of the book, states that more than one unit can perform it, which seems to me to imply that unless otherwise specified, you can only perform each of the actions once per round. However, it's weird that Raise the Banners High specifically has this one or more clause, while the core rule for standard actions specifies you can only perform it once a round. The difference is that psychic actions don't have that core restriction, but also none of them specify that more than one character can do it at a time. So it is super duper ambiguous as to whether or not this one psyker character restriction applies to your entire army, and or whether more than one psyker character can attempt to perform that psychic action around. Typically, I would say probably not, because it does say one, and I think that if the intention was for more than one character to be able to perform the psychic action, it would say one or more, just like Raise the Banners. But the reason that clause is in the Raise the Banners action is because the standard action rules only allow one model or one unit to perform that action at a time anyway. So it requires that in order to be functional as a secondary objective. The psychic actions don't need that, but it would be weird if they had a different templating than the standard actions, even though the core action rules are different. I'm talking way too much about this. I think it seems relatively clear to me that this one restriction is set in stone and only one character can perform that action at a time. But the fact that Raise the Banners and the two types of actions are worded differently throws a little bit of indecision into the mix, and it would be sweet if we could just get that clarified one way or another. I'm a little bit picking at straws here, and this isn't quite as ambiguous as some of the other things that I mentioned in this video. But that said, some of these actions are really difficult if you can't perform them more than once a turn. Mental Interrogation specifically, it's only 3 points, and you have to jump through all these hoops. I mean, Mental Interrogation and Pierce the Veil both are extremely difficult if you can only perform them once per turn. Pierce the Veil specifically is extremely difficult. You have to do so many things to get Pierce the Veil off, and only being able to do it once per turn means you basically have to be doing it from turn 2 in order to have any chance of maximizing it, which is, unfortunately, it just kind of makes it a little bit of an odd decision that you would only allow one character to perform the action every round, but if that is how it works, then that is how it is. Now, speaking of Raise the Banners High, there is an additional question in the Raise the Banners action as well. That being that when you perform a Raise the Banners action, your unit must be in range of an objective marker. Each one that performs the action has to be in range of a different objective marker, obviously. Then at the end of your turn, you raise a banner on, quote, that objective marker. The question arises when you have a unit performing the Raise the Banners action in range of multiple objective markers. What happens then? The action doesn't tell you to choose an objective marker that you're in range of to then raise a banner on. So it seems unintended, but I think the rules as written would allow you to place a banner on every single one of those objective markers. That said, every time objective marker is referenced in the rules, it's singular. So it seems to me that you would have to sort of specify which objective marker you're raising a banner on, except there's no timing in the action for you to ever do that. So, I mean, maybe you choose if your unit's strung out, if you have a unit of 30 models, they walk onto 2 separate objectives, and then they go, I'm going to raise banners. Then at the end of your turn, I guess you would pick, or maybe at the start you would pick, but it's really ambiguous. That one is a real big question, and I think for the most part, we've been playing it in the games that I've played as raise the banners. It does raise multiple banners if you're able to get that off, because there's nothing really that says it doesn't, but it is just a little weird. Okay, going back to the 40k rules, this is actually one that we stumbled upon during the T5S2 Invitational, and I'm actually coming back after originally recording the video to talk about it. Is a little weirdness with the Lookout Sir rule. Now, the Lookout Sir rule requires that a character benefiting from it is visible to the firing model. It's just straight up a clause that's in the rules there. You have to be able to see someone who is being looked out for in order to shoot them at all. And the question is whether or not that overrides the rule for indirect fire weapons that allows them to target units that are not visible to the user. During the Invitational, we ruled this as indirect fire not overriding the Lookout Sir rule. So even if you were the closest model, if you were being looked out, sir, and a basilisk couldn't see you, it could not shoot you, full stop. The rationale there is that this clause is not useful if that is if that's not the intention of the rules designers. There's no purpose to require the character to be visible to you, because otherwise you would just use whatever normal visibility requirements a weapon that you're using has. But Lookout Sir does specifically say that you have to be visible in addition to the normal range weapon targeting requirements that requires you to see the target that you're doing. So in this case, the way we ruled it was that the indirect fire rule for weapons that allowed them to target units that weren't visible overrode the standard targeting restriction that required you to see your target, but didn't also override Lookout Sir. Whether or not that's the intention, I don't know. I assume it is, but an argument could be made either way. It's extremely ambiguous, and that does really need to be addressed because that's an important one. So that's all for today, folks. I want to thank you for watching. This is going to be one of my first videos since the T5S2 Invitational, so if you have not had a chance to go check out coverage of that, we streamed 1 billion hours of very competitive 9th edition 40k games, and it was awesome, so check out the channel for that playlist. I highly recommend viewing those games. As always, big huge thanks to my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. You can join them over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. You get early access to videos, you get exclusive videos, you get some other benefits like early access to T5S2 tournament pods, which have just started. We've launched the first bevy of pods, the first brace of pods just this week, and people are getting their games in. So if you want to jump in, head on over to patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, get on that Patreon, and you will get bumped to the front of the waitlist for any pods that you join. Otherwise, thanks again for watching. Hope everyone has a great time. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.